As a highly sensitive person, are you better off avoiding the spaces that overstimulate you, or are you better off figuring out how to navigate being in them? This is the question that I want to talk about today. And this is inspired by a conversation with one of my kids around this desire that we often have to simply avoid spaces that feel overwhelming and overstimulating as highly sensitive people. So welcome to the podcast SelfKind with me, your host, Erica Webb. I am a registered counselor, a highly sensitive person, as well as a somatic exercise coach and yoga teacher. And I'm thrilled you're here. If you're a highly sensitive person, you are absolutely in the right place because this podcast is for you. And yeah, we're going to talk about this idea of do I avoid these places and spaces and environments that are quite frankly overstimulating, or do I figure out how to be in them? And of course, the answer is it depends, and it depends on a lot of different things. And personally, there's actually a lot of spaces that I avoid. And there are spaces that I choose to put myself into, even though they're uncomfortable, even though I find them overwhelming and overstimulating, but there's good reason to do it. And so I wanted to talk about some questions that you can ask yourself to help you figure that out based on your own needs, because the answer isn't always clear cut. And the conversation that I was having with my child was around the fact that school can often be a really overwhelming space. And I remember as a kid, gosh, every single day I would come home and I would cry because I didn't know this at the time, but so deeply overstimulated and overwhelmed in that environment every single day. And honestly, I never really came up with strategies to manage that because I didn't realize that that was why I was so distressed. And I'm grateful that I can see that, now as an adult. But often we don't know why we don't feel well after being in a particular environment unless we are willing to kind of see it through the lens of our sensitivity and go, oh, my nervous system is just fried from being in that environment. And so yeah, now as an adult, I couldn't avoid school, right, as a kid, and I can't avoid school for my children either. And so there are some environments where we have to say, okay, this is not ideal for my high sensitivity. This doesn't actually work completely for me. However, I need the outcome of this, right? I need my education, or I need my groceries at the supermarket. That's a big one for me. There are certain places, spaces, and environments that we can't necessarily avoid, although we can sometimes find workarounds. And then there are other times where we want to be in these overstimulating environments, not because we want to be overstimulated, but because we want what's there, right? I love going to the theater. I love going and watching professional basketball, but those environments are really overstimulating. And so I kind of go to them knowing that I'm probably going to leave not feeling amazing, but having had a really wonderful time. And so there are certain environments that we might want to go into as highly sensitive people, but we need to kind of develop strategies for how we're going to navigate and manage the impact of that on our system. And so I want to offer you some questions that you can ask yourself to kind of figure out, am I avoiding? And is that avoidance my best plan? Or is this an opportunity where perhaps I can scaffold and support my sensitivity to be able to show up in spaces and environments that matter to me, but without necessarily feeling as awful as I would if I didn't support my sensitivity in that. So I'm going to run through some questions. Some of them will be relevant to pretty much every decision. Some of them won't be. And so, pick and choose them. Take the ones that feel helpful and supportive. Drop the ones that don't. That is perfect. But the first one is to get curious about, is this event, space, thing that I am considering, is it something that I want? Or is it something that I think I should do, or that feels like a burden or an obligation? Now, some would argue that going to work sometimes feels like a burden or an obligation, but it's probably also true that you want to keep your job. And so some of these might be a little bit of both, right? There might be a little bit of obligation or should within that, as well as a desire maybe for the outcome, maybe for part of the process, etc. So this is not always a clear-cut answer, but we do want to get curious, what is my reason? Is it driven by me, or is it driven by somebody else? There have been times where I've been invited to events, particularly things like live music, concerts, festivals, things like that. I don't like them. I don't really enjoy those sorts of environments. And so if I was to say yes to that, for me, most of the time that would be through a sense of obligation or thinking like I don't want to let people down. I feel like I should want to do that. And so that's the kind of thing I mean, right? Whereas if somebody invited me to the basketball, for instance, I love going and watching basketball. So even though it's still a very overstimulating environment, I'd be more likely to be like, no, I want that, right? That's something that I enjoy. That's something that feels like it's coming from me. So that's the first question. Is it a want, a should, an obligation, a burden, a joy, an excitement? What is it for you? And then the second question, second and third really, is like, what am I going to gain? And what might I lose? And that's for both sides of the coin, right? What do I gain if I go? What do I gain if I avoid? What do I lose if I go? What do I lose if I avoid? And one example of this might be, going to the grocery store. So I, for the most part, don't do that. I don't like going to the grocery store. I find it really overwhelming. I can do it. It's fine. Like I can get through it. I can get the groceries. It's okay. But it's very likely that I'm going to go home without everything because I get to the point where I'm like, that'll do. And that my husband finds that really frustrating. So he would rather do the groceries and get them completely finished. And I respect that. That's fair. But if I have to go and do the groceries, what do I gain by going? I gain groceries. I gain food. That is a huge motivator for me because I like to eat things. But what do I lose? Then I might lose a sense of calm by going, right? But this is where we start to get curious about some of those things that maybe we wouldn't otherwise consider. So in that example that I gave of going to like a festival or a concert or something, I would be more hard pressed to kind of tell you the things that I would gain. It would be like the scales would be weighted further into things that I would lose. And that's just based on my personal preference, right? Nothing against festivals and concerts. They're just generally not my thing. But I would be able to kind of clearly see the scales shifting. Whereas for the supermarket, for me, the scales kind of level out a little bit because I really want the food that I'm going to get, right? So silly example, but hopefully that makes sense. So what am I maybe going to gain from this activity, event, place, space, whatever, versus what do I serve to lose? And for both going and avoiding. The next question is sort of similar to our first one, which is what is the goal or purpose behind this? Now, this question is a little bit like, the should versus the desire, etc. But there is a little bit more to this. So, when I was a little girl, if you'd said to me, like, do you want to go to school? The answer was always going to be no. I never wanted to go. I really didn't enjoy it. Did I want an education? Maybe at the time, maybe I didn't, but big me looking back goes, yeah, I wanted an education. And in fact, I used to beg to be homeschooled. So I guess I did want an education, or at least understood the importance of it, but I didn't want to be in that environment. But I think that this is an important thing to think about because the purpose, the end result, the thing that we're working towards by being in that environment or being in that space may well be worth it for us to experience some overstimulation or something that we need to sort of manage and navigate. So again, if I used the example of some sort of conference, I haven't used that example yet, so ignore the again bit, but if we use the example of going to a conference, again, often when I go to conferences or workshops and things, I will often leave with a headache. And that is really common for me. And it is partly because of competing noises in the room and my need to really focus. My sensitivities are very sensory based. And I will often leave not feeling amazing and generally need a day to recover after that. But I serve to gain a lot by being there. And that might be enough to make that okay, right? And so we want to be asking those questions of like, what's my goal? What's my purpose? What's my intended outcome by doing this? It may well be worth it. But then on the other hand, it might not be, right? And so we have to be asking these questions of ourselves to figure out, is this something that I am going to avoid or is this something that I'm going to manage? And then a really important question, like what else is on my plate, right? And so any of the things that we've talked about, any example that you can think of, perhaps it depends a lot on what else is going on for you. And this question I would kind of break up into a couple of different questions. So like, what is on my plate? But then also, where am I in my window of tolerance? So there might be a day where I'm invited to go out to a noisy restaurant bar to meet up with friends. And I'm like, yeah, I've got a lot of resources today. I'm feeling pretty calm. I'm feeling very resourced. I'm feeling like I've had time to nurture myself. That sounds fun. Let's go. And then there might be another day where I have had, just so many things on and it has been so busy and I'm feeling kind of on the edge of my window of tolerance or maybe completely out of my window of tolerance. And the thought of going to a noisy restaurant or a bar or something like that is just too much. And so it can be very situation specific, right? It would be very appropriate for me to avoid that if I'm reading my own nervous system response appropriately and saying, you know what, I don't think I have it in me. I think that's going to be too much for me today. But on other days, it might be perfectly fine. And that nuance is there. But I think we expect ourselves to be so even-keeled, right? And to have such even access to our energy and our resources that we should, that dreaded word should, we should just be able to say yes consistently or know what we're going to be capable of. But that's not often the case for highly sensitive people because our energy can be very variable depending on what we've been exposed to. And then the last part of this is asking the question, okay, if I do go, if I put myself in this environment, if I put myself in this situation, what do I have available to me to scaffold and support my sensitivity? Now, I've done a whole episode on this, so I won't dive too deeply into it, but this idea of scaffolding our sensitivity is around how do I support my sensitivity? How do I not ignore it, not push it away, not say it shouldn't matter, but say, you know what, I am really sensitive to this sensory stimulation that is going to be present at the basketball game. And so what am I going to do to support myself in that? Now, in that example, I actually don't do very much at all. I don't tend to, bring earplugs or anything like that, but you might wear noise reducing headphones. You might put earplugs in. You might choose a seat at the back close to the aisle so that you can get out if you need to. There's all these things that we can do to support our sensitivity. One of the things that comes to mind as well for me is like going to a party and, I don't go to that many parties these days, but thinking of my younger self, one of the things that I would definitely do to support my sensitivity would be to go with someone, right? Whether it was my husband or a friend or anything like that, where I had sort of like this security blanket of I can navigate this space more confidently because I'm with you. And it's really valid to think these things through. What kind of support do I need to enter this space and be in this space and do this thing with a really deep respect for my sensitivity? So that's the other question that I'd be asking. If I'm going to say yes, if I'm going to go and be in this space, if I'm not going to avoid this potentially overwhelming situation, how am I going to support my sensitivity? How am I going to scaffold it? It's a really, really important question to ask. So I hope those questions give you a little bit of food for thought. I think it's really legitimate as highly sensitive people to avoid things sometimes. That is absolutely within your, scope of control. You are allowed to say no to things because they feel overwhelming. And the reality is that sometimes we can't or don't want to say no, right? We want to put ourselves in these situations that have the potential to be overstimulating and overwhelming. So recognize that there is, like everything in this world, so much nuance in that. But if we are taking our sensitivity seriously and recognizing our own needs, I think it becomes a lot easier to navigate those questions. And so I hope the questions that I've posed to you today are helpful. All right, that is it for this episode. I would love to hear if this resonated, if you have any other questions that you would add to that, right? To ask yourself to figure out, am I going, am I not going, am I avoiding, am I not avoiding? I would love to hear from you. And another reminder that Soma Home is going to be running very soon. I feel like I've been talking about it forever at this point, but it is coming. End of April, we are going to start. End of April, beginning of May. And as you're listening to this, the details are up on my website. So go and visit ericawebb.com.au/soma-home. That's SOMA-HOME. And you will find all the details. You'll either find a link to register or link to get more information, or you will also find a link for the early interest list depending on when you're listening to this. So head there if you're curious. But that is my 8-week online group program for highly sensitive people to help us navigate what it is to be in a world that really isn't designed for highly sensitive people, and the things that we can do to support our sensitivity in that, to befriend ourselves, befriend our sensitivity, and find a deeper sense of home within our own skin. So lots more details over on the website. Head there if you would like more. Otherwise, I will be back to chat with you again next week. Keep being kind to yourselves, and I'll talk to you soon.